They are unaccustomed, after all these months, to being just the four of them. For a few days in Agra, which is as foreign to Ashima and Ashok as it is to Gogol and Sonia, they are tourists, staying at a hotel with a swimming pool, sipping bottled water, eating in restaurants with forks and spoons, paying by credit card. Ashima and Ashok speak in broken Hindi, and when young boys approach to sell postcards or marble trinkets, Gogol and Sonia are forced to say English, please. Gogol notices in certain restaurants that they are the only Indians apart from the serving staff. For 2 days they wander around the marble mausoleum that glows grey and yellow and pink and orange depending on the light. They admire its perfect symmetry and pose for photographs beneath the minarets, from which tourists used to leap to their deaths. "I want a picture here, just the two of us," Ashima says to Ashok as they wander around the massive plinth. And so, under the blinding Agra sun, overlooking the dried up Yamuna, Ashok teaches Gogol how to use the Nikon, how to focus and advance the film. A tour guide tells them that after the Taj was completed, each of the builders, 22,000 men, had their thumbs cut off so that the structure could never be built again. That night in the hotel, Sonia wakes up screaming that her own thumbs are missing. "It's just a legend," her parents tell her, but the idea of it haunts Gogol as well. No other building he has seen has affected him so powerfully. Their second day at the Taj, he attempts to sketch the dome and a portion of the facade, but the building's grace eludes him and he throws the attempt away. Instead, he immerses himself in the guidebook, studying the history of Mughal architecture, learning the succession of emperors' names: Babur, Humayun, Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, Aurangzeb. At Agra Fort, he and his family look through the window of the room where Shah Jahan was imprisoned by his own son. At Sikandra, Akbar's tomb, they gaze at gilded frescoes in the entryway, chipped, ransacked, burned, the gems gouged out with penknives, graffiti etched into the stone. At Fatehpur Sikri, Akbar's abandoned sandstone city, they wander among courtyards and cloisters as parrots and hawks fly overhead, and in Salim Chisti's tomb, Ashima ties red threads for good luck to a marble lattice screen. But bad luck trails them on the trip back to Kolkata. At Benares station, Sonia asks her father to buy her a slice of jackfruit, which makes her lips itch unbearably, then swell to 3 times their size. Somewhere in Bihar, in the middle of the night, a businessman in another compartment is stabbed in his sleep and robbed of 300,000 rupees, and the train stops for 5 hours while the local police investigate. The Gangulis learn the cause of the delay the following morning, as breakfast is being served. The passengers, agitated and horrified, all speaking of the same thing. "Wake up! Some guy on the train got murdered," Gogol says to Sonia from his top berth to hers. No one is more horrified than Ashok, who privately recalls that other train, on that other night, and that other field where he had been stopped. This time he had heard nothing. He slept through the whole thing. Upon returning to Kolkata, Gogol and Sonia both get terribly ill. It is the air, the rice, the wind, their relatives casually remark. They were not made to survive in a poor country, they say. They have constipation followed by the opposite. Doctors come to the house in the evening with stethoscopes in black leather bags. They are given courses of enteroquinol, Ajovain water that burns their throats, and once they have recovered it's time to go back. The day they were convinced would never come is just 2 weeks away. Kashmiri pencil cups are bought for Ashok to give to his colleagues at the university. Gogol buys Indian comic books to give to his American friends. On the evening of their departure, he watches his parents standing in front of framed pictures of his dead grandparents on the walls, heads bowed, weeping like children. And then the caravan of taxis and ambassadors comes to whisk them one last time across the city. The flight is at dawn, and so they must leave in darkness, driving through streets so empty they are unrecognizable. A tram with a small single headlight, the only other thing that moves. At the airport the row of people who had greeted them have hosted and fed and fawned over them for all these months, those with whom he shares a name if not his life, assemble once more on the balcony to wave good-bye. Gogol knows that his relatives will stand there until the plane has drifted away, until the flashing lights are no longer visible in the sky. He knows that his mother will sit silently, staring at the clouds, as they journey back to Boston. But for Gogol, relief quickly replaces any lingering sadness. With relief, he peels back the foil covering his breakfast, extracts the silverware from its sealed plastic packing, asks the British Airways stewardess for a glass of orange juice. With relief, he puts on his headset to watch The Big Chill and listen to top 40 songs all the way home. Within 24 hours he and his family are back on Pemberton Road. The late August grass in need of trimming, a quart of milk and some bread left by their tenants in the refrigerator. 4 grocery bags on the staircase filled with mail. At first the Gangulis sleep most of the day and are wide awake at night, gorging themselves on toast at 3 in the morning, unpacking the suitcases one by one. Though they are home, they are disconcerted by the space, by the uncompromising silence that surrounds them. They still feel somehow in transit, still discontinued from their lives, bound up in an alternate schedule, an intimacy only the 4 of them share. But by the end of the week, after his mother's friends come to admire her new gold and saris, after the 8 suitcases have been aired out on the sun deck and put away, after the chanachur is poured into the Tupperware and the smuggled mangoes eaten before breakfast with cereal and tea, it's as if they have never been gone. "How dark you have become," his parents' friends say regretfully to Gogol and Sonia. On this end there is no effort involved. They retreat to their 3 rooms, to their 3 separate beds, to their thick mattresses and pillows and fitted sheets. After a single trip to the supermarket, the refrigerator and the cupboards fill with familiar labels: Skippy, Hood, Bumblebee, Land O'Lakes. His mother enters the kitchen and prepares their meals once again. His father drives the car and mows the lawn and returns to the university. Gogol and Sonia sleep for as long as they want, watch television, make themselves peanut butter and jelly sandwiches at any time of day. Once again they are free to quarrel, to tease each other, to shout and holler and say shut up. They take hot showers, speak to each other in English, ride their bicycles around the neighborhood. They call up their American friends who are happy enough to see them, but ask them nothing about where they've been. And so the 8 months are put behind them, quickly shed, quickly forgotten, like clothes worn for a special occasion, or for a season that has passed, suddenly cumbersome, irrelevant to their lives. In September, Gogol returns to high school to begin his junior year. Honors Biology, Honors US History, Advanced Trigonometry, Spanish, Honors English. In his English class, he reads Ethan Frome, The Great Gatsby, The Good Earth, The Red Badge of Courage. He takes his turn at the podium and recites the Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow speech from Macbeth, the only lines of poetry he will know by heart for the rest of his life. His teacher, Mr. Lawson, is a slight, wiry, shamelessly preppy man with a surprisingly deep voice, reddish blonde hair, smallish but penetrating green eyes, horn-rimmed glasses. He is the subject of school-wide speculation and slight scandal, having once been married to Miss Sagan, who teaches French. He wears khakis and Shetland sweaters in bright solid colors, Kelly green and yellow and red, sips black coffee continually from the same chipped blue mug, cannot survive the 50-minute class without excusing himself to go to the teacher's lounge for a cigarette. In spite of his diminutive stature, he has a commanding, captivating presence in the room. His handwriting is famously illegible. Student compositions are regularly returned stamped with tan rings of coffee, sometimes golden rings of Scotch. Every year he gives everyone either a D or an F for the first assignment, an analysis of Blake's The Tiger. A number of girls in the class insist that Mr. Lawson is indescribably sexy and have raging crushes on him. Mr. Lawson is the first of Gogol's teachers to know and to care about Gogol the author. The first day of class he looked up from the podium when he came to Gogol's name under the rooster, an expression of benign amazement on his face. Unlike other teachers, he did not ask, "Was that really his name? Was that the last name? Was it short for something else?" He did not ask, as many foolishly did, "Wasn't he a writer?" Instead, he called out the name in a perfectly reasonable way, without pause, without doubt, without a suppressed smile, just as he had called out Brian and Erica and Tom. And then, well, we're going to have to read The Overcoat. Either that or The Nose. One January morning the week after Christmas vacation, Gogol sits at his desk by the window and watches a thin, sugary snow fall inconsistently from the sky. "We're going to have to devote this quarter to the short story," Mr. Lawson announces, and instantly Gogol knows. With growing dread and a feeling of slight nausea, he watches as Mr. Lawson distributes the books piled on his desk, giving half a dozen well-worn copies of an anthology, short story classics, to each of the students at the front of the rows. Gogol's copy is particularly battered, the corner blunted, the cover spotted as if by a whitish mold. He looks at the table of the contents, sees Gogol listed after Faulkner, before Hemingway. The sight of it printed in capital letters on the crinkly page upsets him viscerally. It's as though the name were a particularly unflattering snapshot of himself that makes him want to say, in his defense, "That's not really me." Gogol wants to excuse himself, to raise his hand and take a trip to the lavatory. But at the same time he wants to draw as little attention to himself as possible. And so he sits, avoiding eye contact with any of his classmates, the pages through the book. A number of authors' names have been starred with penciled asterisks by previous readers, but there is no sign or mark by Nikolai Gogol's name. A single story corresponds with each author's name. The one by Gogol is called The Overcoat, but for the rest of the class, Mr. Lawson does not mention Gogol. Instead, to Gogol Ganguly's relief, they take turns reading aloud from The Necklace by Guy de Maupassant. Perhaps Gogol begins to wonder hopefully. Mr. Lawson has no intention of assigning the Gogol story. Perhaps he has forgotten about it. But as the bell rings and the students rise collectively from their desks, Mr. Lawson holds up a hand. "Read the Gogol for tomorrow," he hollers as they shuffle through the door. The following day, Mr. Lawson writes Nikolai Vasilievich Gogol in capital letters on the board, draws a box around it, then writes the dates of the author's birth and death in parentheses. Gogol opens the binder on his desk, reluctantly copies the information down. He tells himself it isn't so strange. There is, after all, a William in the class, if not an Ernest. Mr. Lawson's left hand guides the chalk rapidly across the board, but Gogol's pen begins to lag. The loose-leaf pages remain blank, as those of his classmates fill up with facts on which he will most likely be quizzed soon. Born 1809 in the province of Poltava to a family of Ukrainian Cossack gentry. Father, a small landowner who also wrote plays, died when Gogol was 16. Studied at the Lyceum of Nezhin, went to St. Petersburg in 1828, where he entered in 1829 the civil service, in the Department of Public Works for the Ministry of the Interior. From 1830 to 31, transferred to the court ministry in the Department of Royal Estates, after which time he became a teacher, lecturing on history at the Young Ladies' Institute and later at the University of St. Petersburg. At the age of 22, established a close friendship with Alexander Pushkin. In 1830, published his first short story. In 1836, a cosmic play, The Government Inspector, was produced in St. Petersburg. Dismayed by the play's mixed reception, left Russia. For the next 12 years lived abroad, in Paris, Rome, and elsewhere, composing the first volume of Dead Souls, the novel considered to be his finest work. Mr. Lawson sits on the edge of his desk, crosses his legs, turns a few pages in a yellow legal pad covered with notes. Beside the legal pad is a biography of the author, a thick book called Divided Soul, the pages marked by numerous scraps of torn-up paper. "Not your ordinary guy, Nikolai Gogol," Mr. Lawson says. "He is celebrated today as one of Russia's most brilliant writers, but during his life he was understood by no one, least of all himself. One might say he typified the phrase eccentric genius." Gogol's life in a nutshell was a steady decline into madness. The writer, Ivan Turgenev, described him as an intelligent, queer, and sickly creature. He was reputed to be a hypochondriac and a deeply paranoid, frustrated man. He was, in addition, by all accounts, morbidly melancholic, given to fits of severe depression. He had trouble making friends. He never married, fathered no children. It's commonly believed he died a virgin. Warmth spread from the back of Gogol's neck to his cheeks and his ears. Each time the name is uttered, he quietly winces. His parents have never told him any of this. He looks at his classmates, but they seem indifferent, obediently copying down the information as Mr. Lawson continues to speak, looking over one shoulder, his sloppy handwriting filling up the board. He feels angry at Mr. Lawson suddenly. Somehow he feels betrayed. Gogol's literary career spanned a period of about 11 years, after which he was more or less paralyzed by writer's block. The last years of his life were marked by physical deterioration and emotional torment. Mr. Lawson says, desperate to restore his health and creative inspiration, Gogol sought refuge in a series of spas and sanatoriums. In 1848, he made a pilgrimage to Palestine. Eventually he returned to Russia. In 1852, in Moscow, disillusioned and convinced of his failure as a writer, he renounced all literary activity and burned the manuscript to the second volume of Dead Souls. He then pronounced a death sentence on himself and proceeded to commit slow suicide by starvation. "Gross," someone says from the back of the classroom. Why would someone do that to himself? A few people glance at Emily Gardner, rumored to have anorexia. Mr. Lawson, holding up a finger, goes on. In attempts to revive him on the day before his death, doctors immersed him in a bath of broth while ice water was poured over his head, and then affixed 7 leeches to his nose. His hands were pinned down so that he could not tear the worms away. The class, all but one, begins to moan in unison, so that Mr. Lawson has to raise his voice considerably in order to be heard. Gogol stares at his desk, seeing nothing. He is convinced that the entire school is listening to Mr. Lawson's lecture, that it's on the PA. He lowers his head over his desk, discreetly presses his hands against his ears. It's not enough to block out Mr. Lawson. By the following evening he was no longer fully conscious, and so wasted that his spine could be felt through his stomach. Gogol shuts his eyes. "Please stop," he wishes he could say to Mr. Lawson. "Please stop," he says, mouthing the words, and then suddenly there is silence. Gogol looks up and sees Mr. Lawson drop his chalk on the blackboard ledge. "I'll be right back," he says, and disappears to have a cigarette. The students, accustomed to this routine, begin talking among themselves. They complain about the story, saying that it's too long. They complain that it was hard to get through. There is talk of the difficulty of Russian names, students confessing merely to skimming them. Gogol says nothing. He has not read the story himself. He has never touched the Gogol book his father gave him on his 14th birthday. And yesterday, after class, he had shoved the short story anthology deep into his locker, refusing to bring it home. To read the story, he believes, would mean paying tribute to his namesake, accepting it somehow. Still, listening to his classmates complain, he feels perversely responsible, as if his own work was being attacked. Mr. Lawson returns, sitting once more on his desk. Gogol hopes that perhaps the biographical portion of the lecture is over. What else could he possibly have left to say? But Mr. Lawson picks up Divided Soul. "Here is an account of his final moments," he says, and turning towards the end of the book, he reads, "His feet were icy. Tarasenkov slid hot water bottle into the bed, but it had no effect. He was shivering. Cold sweat covered his emaciated face. Blue circles appeared under his eyes. At midnight, Dr. Klementov relieved Dr. Tarasenkov. To ease the dying man, he administered a dose of calomel and placed loaves of hot bread around his body. Gogol began to moan again. His mind wandered quietly all night long. "Go on," he whispered. "Rise up. Charge. Charge the mill." Then he became still weaker. His face hollowed and darkened. His breathing became imperceptible. He seemed to grow calm. At least he was no longer suffering. At 8 in the morning of February 21st, 1852, he breathed his last. He was not yet 43 years old. Gogol does not date anyone in high school. He suffers quiet crushes, which he admits to no one, on this girl or that girl with whom he is already friends. He does not attend dances or parties. He and his group of friends, Colin and Jason and Mark, prefer to listen to records together, to Dylan and Clapton and The Who, and read Nietzsche in their spare time. His parents do not find it strange that their son doesn't date, does not rent a tuxedo for the junior prom. They have never been on a date in their lives, and therefore they see no reason to encourage Gogol, certainly not at his age. Instead, they urge him to join the math team and maintain his A average. His father presses him to pursue engineering, perhaps at MIT. Assured by his grades and his apparent indifference to girls, his parents don't suspect Gogol of being, in his own way, an American teenager. They don't suspect him, for instance, of smoking pot, which he does from time to time when he and his friends get together and listen to records at one another's homes. They don't suspect him, when he goes to spend the night at a friend's house, of driving to a neighboring town to the Rocky Horror Picture Show, or into Boston to see bands in Kenmore Square. One Saturday, soon before he is scheduled to take the SAT, his family drives to Connecticut for the weekend, leaving Gogol at home alone overnight for the first time in his life. It never crosses his parents' mind that instead of taking timed practice tests in his room, Gogol will drive with Colin and Jason and Mark to a party. They are invited by Colin's older brother, who is a freshman at the university where Gogol's father teaches. He dresses for the party as he normally does, in Levi's and boat shoes and a checkered flannel shirt. For all the times he has been to campus, to visit his father at the engineering department, or for swimming lessons, or to run laps around the track, he has never been in a dorm before. They approach nervously, a bit giddy, afraid to be caught. "If anyone asks, my brother said to say we're freshmen at Amherst," Colin advises them in the car. The party occupies an entire hallway, the doors of the individual rooms all open. They enter the first room they can manage to, crowded, dark, hot. No one notices as Gogol and his 3 friends make their way across the room to the keg. For a while they stand in a circle holding their plastic cups of beer, shouting over the music in order to be heard. But then Colin sees his brother in the hallway, and Jason needs to find a bathroom, and Mark needs another beer already. Gogol drifts into the hallway as well. Everyone seems to know everyone else, embroiled in conversations that are impossible to join. Music playing from the different rooms mingles unpleasantly in Gogol's ears. He feels too wholesome in this ripped jeans and t-shirt crowd. Fears his hair was too recently washed and is too neatly combed. And yet it doesn't seem to matter. No one seems to care. At the end of the hallway he climbs a set of stairs, and at the top there is another hallway, equally crowded and loud. In the corner he sees a couple kissing, pressed up against the wall. Instead of pushing his way through to the other end of the hallway, he decides to climb another set of stairs. This time the hallway is deserted. An expanse of dark blue carpeting and white wooden doors. The only presence in the space is the sound of muffled music and voices coming from doors below. He is about to turn back down the staircase when one of the doors opens and a girl emerges. A pretty, slender girl wearing buttoned-up polka-dotted thrift store dress and scuffed Doc Martens. She has short brown hair curving in toward her cheeks and cut in a high fringe over her brows. Her face is heart-shaped, her lips painted a glamorous red. "Sorry," Gogol says. "Am I not supposed to be up here?" "Well, it's technically a girl's floor," the girl says. "But that's never stopped a guy before." She studies him thoughtfully, as no other girl has looked at him. "You don't go here, do you?" "No," he says, his heart pounding, and then he remembers his surreptitious identity for the evening. "I'm a freshman at Amherst." "That's cool," the girl says, walking toward him. "I'm Kim." "Nice to meet you." He extends his hand and Kim shakes it, a bit longer than necessary. For a moment she looks at him expectantly, then smiles, revealing two front teeth that are slightly overlapping. "Come on," she says. "I can show you around." They walk together downstairs. She leads him to a room where she gets herself a beer and he pours himself another. He stands awkwardly at her side as she pauses to say hello to friends. They work their way to a common area where there is a television, a Coke machine, a shabby sofa, and an assortment of chairs. They sit on the sofa, slouching, a considerable space between them. Kim notices a stray pack of cigarettes on the coffee table and lights one. "Well?" she says, turning to look at him somewhat suspiciously this time. "What?" "Aren't you going to introduce yourself to me?" "Oh," he says. "Yeah." But he doesn't want to tell Kim his name. He doesn't want to endure her reaction, to watch her lovely blue eyes grow wide. He wishes there were another name he could use, just this once, to get him through the evening. It wouldn't be so terrible. He has lied to her already about being at Amherst. He could introduce himself as Colin or Jason or Mark, as anybody at all, and their conversation could continue, and she would never know or care. There were a million names to choose from. But then he realizes there's no need to lie. Not technically. He remembers the other name that had once been chosen for him. The one that should have been. "I'm Nickel," he says, for the first time in his life. He says it tentatively, his voice sounding strained to his ears, the statement turning, without his meaning to it, into a question. He looks at Kim, his eyebrows furrowed, prepared for her to challenge him, to correct him, to laugh in his face. He holds his breath. His face tingles. Whether from triumph or terror he isn't sure. But Kim accepts it gladly. "Nikhil," she says, blowing a thin plume of smoke toward the ceiling. Again she turns to him and smiles. "Nikhil," she repeats. "I've never heard that before. That's a lovely name." They sit a while longer, the conversation continuing. Gogol stunned at how easy it is. His mind floats. He only half listens as Kim talks about her classes, about the town in Connecticut where she's from. He feels at once guilty and exhilarated, protected as if by an invisible shield. Because he knows he will never see her again. He is brave that evening, kissing her lightly on the mouth as she is talking to him, his legs pressed gently against her leg on the sofa, briefly running a hand through her hair. It is the first time he has kissed anyone, the first time he has felt a girl's face and body and breath so close to his own. "I can't believe you kissed her, Gogol," his friends exclaim as they drive home from the party. He shakes his head in a daze, as astonished as they are, elation still welling inside him. "It wasn't me," he nearly says, but he doesn't tell them that it hadn't been Gogol who had kissed him, that Gogol had had nothing to do with it.